Somewhat recently, we finally received multiple trailers for Pokémon Legends Z-A after an entire year of silence. I was very excited to see the direction this game would be taking, and I have very high hopes regarding the quality of the game. Because I'm so excited for what Z-A will offer, I decided to take an extremely close look at each scene in the trailers and offer my thoughts on what I found. Before I can get into the trailers though, I think it's important to note how happy it made me to get a full year of silence for the game. It's a bit of a risky move on Game Freak's end because if you let fans fantasize for too long, they'll likely be disappointed because they've gotten their hopes up too high. However, I prefer this approach of rolling out a new game to the approach used during the unveiling of Gen 7 where we basically knew about all of the new Pokémon before the games even released. This also happened in Gen 8 through leaks and data mines, but clearly that wasn't Game Freak's fault. Gen 7 opened with a ton of information through official trailers, and the subsequent lack of new things to discover for myself made Gen 7 as a whole harder to appreciate. In addition to the wonderful year of silence and speculation, Z-A is also going to be the first ever main series Pokémon game with a development time of almost 4 years. Z-A began development right after Scarlet and Violet ended their development in early 2022, so Z-A releasing in late 2025 means that the game has been in development for just shy of 4 years. Given quality issues that the last few generations have had, I think this is a step in the right direction, and I hope that every game moving forwards has at minimum 4 years of development time. Of course, these 4 years of development time need to equate to a quantity and quality of content that meets or sets a standard among its peers, and that remains to be seen. Getting into the trailers themselves, immediately we need to address the fact that this Legends title isn't what most of us expected from a Legends game. Pokémon Legends Arceus was the first game in the Legends series to release, and it takes place in the past. We meet ancestors of characters we've already met in other titles, and Legends being part of the title indicates that we should expect the story to be about something that took place a long time ago. However, immediately upon seeing the trailer, we're met with a new Lumio City. This means that Legends Z-A is less of a Legends title as we previously understood it, and more like an X and Y 2. I interpret this to mean that even though the setting of the game takes place after X and Y, the actual plot of the game will center on past events. In particular, I think the plot of the game will try to address the conflicting origins of Mega Evolution, but we'll talk more about that later. We know Legends Z-A takes place after X and Y for a few obvious reasons. The first is that Lumio City simply looks modern, but the second, and arguably most important, is that we see AZ alongside the Eternal Flower Floette running a hotel together. AZ and the Eternal Flower Floette being present together means that this must take place after the events of X and Y because they had previously been separated for 3,000 years. I'd like to take a brief moment to discuss AZ because there are a few very interesting things that I noticed about him. First, I'd like to discuss his design. When we first meet AZ in X and Y, he's ragged and dirty after wandering the world for 3,000 years. He was also very large in-game, but we never really had a good idea of just how much larger he was because of how the character models were in X and Y. However, we can now see from what he's wearing just how large he is. He's so large that they had to take 2 different suits and stitch them together to account for how lanky he is. I actually did find a measurement for how tall AZ is, and as it turns out, he's 274 centimeters or 9 foot tall. Another part of his design that caught my attention was his cane. Previously, AZ only utilized the knee brace, but the cane edition is new. I don't know if AZ having a cane implies anything that we don't already know about him, like maybe the cane indicates that he's aged more, but I do like the representation of people with disabilities, and it simply makes sense for someone as old and as tall as AZ is. I can't imagine how much his knees and back hurt after 3,000 years of being that tall and aimlessly wandering the world. Remember that point about the cane representing people with disabilities though, it'll come up later. Speaking of how long he wandered the world, I think making AZ a humble hotel owner is perfect for his character. I saw a lot of people saying that someone with AZ's troubled past running a hotel is inappropriate, but I can't think of anything better for him. The purpose of AZ being reunified with the Eternal Flower Floette was to show that he has redeemed himself and that he has been forgiven by his best friend. He has gone from being a vengeful and destructive king to a grief-stricken and regretful wanderer for 3,000 years, and now he is a humble hotel manager who provides a place to rest for all weary wanderers as he once was. I think it's perfect, and I hope that his role in the story is limited to simply being a kind hotel manager. Anything more would negatively impact his character arc and his story, in my opinion. He has earned his rest and he deserves to relax and be happy with his best friend. I've talked about AZ for perhaps a bit longer than a moment at this point, so let's move on to the other characters. Let's start with the designs of Harmony and Paxton, our 2 main characters. I've seen a lot of jokes about how Harmony and Paxton look strikingly similar to Professor Sycamore and Grace, which could imply that the short love letter joke in X and Y led to Sycamore and Grace having kids together, but I'm not sure that I buy it. If that is true though, that would make these characters the younger half-siblings of Caleb and Serena. We've never had a protagonist that is canonically the younger sibling of a former protagonist protagonist, and I actually think that would be a great idea, especially considering that this is apparently X and Y2 instead of what we previously understood the Legends titles to be. We'll know for sure once Z-A comes out though, since Sycamore's lab is still present in Lumio City and presumably we'll be meeting him at some point in the game. However, all of this said, Harmony and Paxton also look very similar to Ethan and Lyra in Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Normally this wouldn't mean that much, but considering that 2 of the 3 starters are from Johto and the recent 25th anniversary of Gen 2, I think it's probably more likely that these designs are meant to be Gen 2 references instead of Sycamore and Grace's kids. I will say that I do really like the default protagonist designs though, and I'm not talking about their outfits. Trainer customization has been standard for a while now in Pokemon games, so the outfits themselves are things I don't pay much attention to anymore, which is a whole other discussion in itself. Instead, I'm referring to the way the characters themselves are designed, the way their heads are shaped, their eyes, their proportions, etc. I thought the Scarlet and Violet protagonist designs were horrible, sauceless even. I'm extremely happy that we've moved in a different direction for Z-A. I am very curious though about the symbol on the jacket that both protagonists have, and their Mega Ring designs also look particularly interesting. We also got to see the rival designs, and we even learned their names. Urbane and Tawny also have incredibly strong designs. You might have already noticed, but these characters are very similar to the protagonist designs. That is because gender-locked rivals have returned, but with a twist. If you choose the female protagonist, then Urbane will be your rival, and his design is simply an altered version of the male protagonist. The same is true in reverse, where if you pick the male protagonist, Tawny will be your rival, and is an altered version of the female protagonist. I know a lot of people out there are sad that they can't have a female protagonist and female rival, or a male protagonist and a male rival, but I'm interested in this concept. This is the first time Game Freak has tried gender-locked rivals in a while, and I can't help but wonder why they've brought it back now. There must be a reason, and if gender-locked rivals are somehow important to the story, I think this is a great way to implement them. I'm also very curious as to whether these two trainers will have any significant personality differences between each other. The last thing I have to say about these trainers is that their names are literally Urban and Towny, and that's hilarious. And no, I'm not going to talk about Hex Mommy. The internet has said enough about her already. I don't have much to say about Vinny right now either, but I will talk about him for a little bit later. Instead, I want to focus on another character that I think a lot of people have overlooked, and that would be Jet. At first glance, Jet doesn't seem like anything special. Sure, she may or may not be the twist antagonist, who knows, maybe it'll be that Zack character that simply wants to abolish all forms of transit in Lumiose except taxis. But more importantly, I noticed that Jet shares some very slight similarities to Colress of all people. This is fascinating because Colress is one of the more under-the-radar characters in Pokemon. If we find out that maybe this is Colress's mother, or maybe his sister if we want to feel especially old today, we might get some significant insight into Colress's backstory. Regardless of whether Jet is the primary antagonist or not, I'm excited to investigate what she brings to the lore, especially if it provides more insight into Colress. Speaking of investigations, confidentiality and hidden documents seem to be very important to the plot. We see in the trailers that confidential folders are being examined and are a focal point. This is interesting because it wraps back around to the third, and as far as I can tell, final reason for why we know this game takes place after X and Y. We get a very quick glimpse of this office, but this room is actually Looker's former Lumio City office. At the end of X and Y, Looker purchases the entire building his office is located within and gifts it to Emma, who then becomes the head detective in Lumio City. And wouldn't you know it, but when we examine what we see in the trailer, we find a framed photo of an Esper on the desk. This Esper is likely Mimi, Emma's Esper, and this office likely belongs to Emma. Considering the focus on investigation that Z-A seems to have, it seems likely that Emma will be returning as a key character in the plot and that we'll be working closely with her. Hi there, this is a quick edit from the future. Because I've taken so long to put this video together, I've had to make an emergency edit to the script so that I can include this particular image. Pokémon Legends Z-A was recently announced to be releasing on October 16th, 2025. I'll be using this image later for another topic, take note of how many Mega Pokémon there are here, but I've decided to make a special edit here so that I can talk about one thing that tells me that my plot guesses might be onto something. If we look at this image closely, we'll notice one particular trainer stands out. The trainer with the Mega Lucario. I don't know about you guys, but this looks a lot like Emma, simply with shorter hair. She even appears to still be wearing the Essentia suit from the X and Y post game, but over that she seems to be wearing a pea coat that slightly resembles what we see Looker wearing. So I think my plot guesses are right on the nose as far as Emma is concerned. As for where Looker himself is, or if he'll be in Z-A, well, the answer to that gets quite complicated. Looker in X and Y seems to be the same Looker that we met in Platinum, Black, and White. However, the next time we see Looker after X and Y is in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire in the Battle Resort. Looker has washed up on the shore and lost his memory. He gifts the player with an Audinite, but we don't learn much else from him. We then meet Looker again in Gen 7, where Looker is revealed to have been working with the International Police for the last 10 years alongside Fallers. Fallers are people who have fallen through ultra wormholes into other spaces, times, and dimensions, and in the process lose their memories. We never get confirmation that Looker is actually a Faller, but given that he's working with Fallers and that he suffered the same symptoms as a Faller, it's probably safe to say that Looker is a Faller. Again, Looker being a Faller isn't confirmed or anything, but it absolutely fits, and it's the most likely non-meta explanation for this series of events. Given that Looker seemingly fell through an ultra wormhole in Kalos, then washed up in Hoenn with none of his memories, and then somehow wound up in Alola where he's been working with other Fallers for the last 10 years, unless Looker has regained his memory since we last saw him and has come back to Lumio City to check in on Emma, I doubt he'll be showing up in Z-A. I'm finally done talking about characters, so let's move on to talking about Lumio City itself. I think it's very likely that the plot of the game is going to focus on Lumio's Tower. Lumio's Tower is literally at the heart of the city, and it seems incredibly likely that the climax of the game will be located within, under, or at the top of the tower. You may be confused about why I'd say under or at the top, but looking at the trailer shows that there's actually a considerable focus on verticality for Z-A. The strongest argument I have for this is the fact that we can actually ascend to the roofs of the building within Lumio City. I can't think of any other time in a main series Pokémon game where parkour between buildings was ever a gameplay feature. And if we can go up in this game, we should probably anticipate that going down is also possible. As for where we would be going down to, well, real-life Paris has the Paris Catacombs, which have been the center of fan theories ever since Z-A was announced. Alternatively, if the climax of the game isn't within these hypothetical catacombs, it could take place on top of or within the tower itself. We know that the tower is significant due to the visual similarities it has with an element of the logo for Z-A, and the tower's placement at the center of the city makes for a perfect place to steer the game towards. Just like how both Platinum and Legends Arceus both have their most important moments at Spear Pillar, a location that is also simultaneously at the heart of the region and vertically impressive. As for what makes the tower so special, I brought up earlier that there may be a number of Gen 2 references in this game, seeing as it was developed during the 25th anniversary of Gen 2. 2 of the 3 starters are from Johto, and the protagonist designs do look a bit like Ethan and Lyra. But there's a third interesting Gen 2 reference if we consider that the climax of the game may in fact focus on the radio wave capabilities of the Lumiose Tower. The Eiffel Tower in the real world was briefly used as a radio tower, and if the antagonist takes control of the Lumiose Tower to utilize its radio wave capabilities, this would reference Team Rocket taking over Goldenrod City's radio tower in Gen 2. The last reason why I believe Lumiose Tower is key to the plot is simply because of the stance of apparent aggression that Zygarde takes against the tower at the end of the first trailer. It's possible that this stance isn't aggression and that maybe it's actually determination or longing or something along those lines, but no matter the reason, Zygarde is focused on the tower. To wrap things up as far as plot guesses go, since we already know that Mega Evolution has returned and that the protagonist acquires a Mega Ring, it's safe to say that Mega Evolution will likely be central to the plot, at least to some degree. Speaking of Mega Evolutions, I have to say that I'm actually quite happy that we didn't get to see any new Mega Evolutions in any of the new trailers. That isn't to say that I don't want new Mega Evolutions, because I definitely do. But like I said earlier, I like it when there are discoveries to be made for myself in these games before official marketing of all things spoils me. Speaking of Mega Evolution though, I'm very curious to see whether or not Z-A will try to once again rewrite the lore about Mega Evolution. When Mega Evolution was first introduced in Gen 6, Mega Evolution had very different lore from what would be established later. At first, Mega Evolution was theorized to be caused by stones that Xerneas and Yveltal influenced, and as such was a localized phenomenon within the Kalos region specifically. Obviously, this bit of lore was altered immediately with the next games to release, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, which not only allowed Mega Evolution to take place in the Hoenn region, but also had the champion of the region, Steven, utilize it as part of his skill set. This is something that should not be possible for Professor Sycamore to ignore as the leading professor in the study of Mega Evolution, but even aside from Steven, and others having access to Mega Evolution in the Hoenn region, Mega Rayquaza disproves Sycamore's entire theory about Mega Evolution originating from stones influenced by the power of Xerneas and Yveltal. Rayquaza is able to undergo Mega Evolution by itself via the power of a special organ it has, dubbed the Mikado organ. This means that Xerneas and Yveltal have nothing to do with Rayquaza's ability to Mega Evolve, which essentially ruins Professor Sycamore's entire theory. Either Sycamore is a complete joke of a professor who not only somehow didn't know that the most famous trainer in the Hoenn region had access to the power of Mega Evolution, and also didn't research any of Hoenn's legends about Rayquaza's Mega Evolution, or Game Freak decided to immediately change the lore of Mega Evolution after the release of X and Y for reasons that I'll explain now. Gen 6 was a very turbulent time for Game Freak, who at the time started the Gear project in an effort to branch out from Pokémon games. Game Freak didn't want to be trapped making Pokémon games forever, and they decided to allow for small teams to form within the company that were working on different game pitches. Simultaneously, Pokémon Z was scrapped, and some of the concepts for it were either saved for later or haphazardly shoved into Sun and Moon. There's a few different videos covering this topic that do a much better job reporting on what happened during that time than I have in this video, since the topic of this video is different. But if you're interested in learning more, Did You Know Gaming and Lewtwo have done an excellent job documenting and researching everything I just spoke about regarding Game Freak, the Gear project, and Pokémon Z being scrapped. Links to their videos covering the topic will be in the description. I mention all of this because alongside Z being scrapped, the concepts of Z being forced into Sun and Moon, and the lore of Mega Evolution being rewritten for Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, the lore of Mega Evolution was once again altered during Sun and Moon. Suddenly, Mega Evolution is seen as a bad thing, and all of the Pokédex entries for Mega Evolved Pokémon now detail these evolutions as forced, painful, and unnatural evolutions that only the cruelest and most power-hungry trainers would force their Pokémon to endure. In my opinion, this sudden narrative change about Mega Evolution was one of two things. Either Game Freak originally intended for this rewritten lore to be revealed in Z, which I find unlikely due to Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire also contradicting almost everything that we knew about Mega Evolution as it was introduced in X and Y, or maybe Game Freak decided that in order to be spontaneous and innovative, they needed to remove Mega Evolution to make room for future gimmicks. Game Freak also probably felt that they needed to give a reason for why Mega Evolution wouldn't be a supported gimmick in the franchise moving forward. This is a situation that Game Freak put themselves in by first locking Mega Evolution to Kalos, then unlocking it and expanding it to also include Hoenn, and then suddenly locking it from ever appearing again in a main series game, that is, until now. I trust you see where I'm going with all of this. If Z-A takes place after the events of Gen 6, 7, and 8, as is implied by the presence of AZ and the Eternal Flower Floette running the hotel together, then that would mean that the world should already know that Mega Evolution is harmful to Pokémon. But in the trailers, we already see that Mega Evolution is back. So either Kalos trainers simply don't care about their Pokémon, or previous lore about Mega Evolution is once again being rewritten. If we assume that Mega Evolutions are going to play a somewhat significant role in the story, then I think it's highly likely that Game Freak will completely ignore the lore about Mega Evolutions written in Gen 7, and will instead either come up with another nonsense reason to exclude Mega Evolutions from future titles, or will simply not explain why Mega Evolutions will not appear in future titles. Game Freak loves to ceaselessly innovate, and part of that innovation is constantly taking what you love away from you and giving you a chance to experience something different and new. Whether or not this is a good or bad thing depends on your own individual point of view. I prefer consistent world building, and I hope that Game Freak at least has a sensible solution for why Mega Evolution likely won't appear in future titles. And I also hope that they stop rewriting the lore of Mega Evolution almost every single time it appears in a main series game. But I don't have my hopes up. One of the things we do know for sure about the plot of Z-A is the importance of the Z-A Royale. The Z-A Royale is a tournament where trainers have to battle up a point ladder which will determine what trainer rank you are. You start off as a Z rank trainer and you'll have to battle your way up to A rank. The prize for reaching the A rank is that you may have a wish granted, which is very, very peculiar. How are these wishes granted? Is it possible that a Pokemon grants the wishes of whoever wins the Z-A Royale? If that's true, the only wish-granting Pokemon that we know of is Jirachi, and it seems like a stretch to believe that Jirachi of all Pokemon will make an appearance in Z-A. But depending on this next point, maybe Hoenn Legendaries and Mythicals showing up in Z-A isn't as much of a stretch as it seems. Quasartico Inc. has a very interesting name that I've been trying to figure out since it was revealed. I mentioned earlier that Mega Evolutions existing in Hoenn introduced a massive plot hole in regards to what X and Y taught us about Mega Evolution's history in, and exclusivity to, the Kalos region. But the more I think about the Quasar part of Quasartico, the more I think about the only Pokemon we currently know of that is related to Quasars, Rayquaza. Indeed, the more I think about it, the more it feels like potentially Mega Rayquaza may play a role in Z-A. It's clear that Game Freak really, really, really likes Rayquaza due to how much pandering and overrepresentation it has received over the last decade. And Rayquaza being important in Z-A could make sense if Game Freak somehow tries to explain the weird fracture in the lore regarding the origins of Mega Evolution that X, Y, Omega Ruby, and Alpha Sapphire can't seem to agree on. I haven't kept up with the new anime, so I'm speaking from an uninformed position on this point in particular, but Roy having a shiny Rayquaza makes a lot more sense from a marketing perspective if Rayquaza suddenly becomes conversationally relevant again when Z-A releases. And while this may be a stretch, if Mega Rayquaza is indeed important to Quasartico Inc., then all of a sudden it makes a little more sense for why Vinny has decided to look like that. I can't come up with any other reason for Vinny to willingly look like this. All this said, the entire idea about Rayquaza being significant in Z-A is pure speculation. But if Rayquaza isn't involved, then I must wonder what Quasartico is all about. Maybe the wish granter in this situation is actually Hoopa, and all of the speculation about Hoenn Pokemon is completely wrong. There's still plenty of mystery when it comes to Z-A's plot, and it's impossible to know for sure at this point, so let's move on to another topic. It's time to delve into everybody's favorite thing to talk about when it comes to Pokemon games, and that's graphics. As far as my initial feelings go for the graphics of Z-A, I must say that I'm pleasantly surprised. I am of the opinion that Scarlet and Violet were the worst looking and worst playing Pokemon games to be released since X and Y. The graphics didn't seem like they should be all that demanding. After all, there are much prettier games on the Switch, which made the horrible to play with unstable frame rate feel even more frustrating and confusing. So I honestly wasn't quite sure if the graphics and performance of Z-A would be even marginally better than Scarlet and Violet. I know that sounds silly considering that in most franchises, the graphics and performance of later games tend to be better than what came before. But Legends Arceus definitely had better performance than Scarlet and Violet and had comparable graphical fidelity. Anyway, when it comes to Z-A, I'm happy with the textures and I'm very happy with the lighting improvements. And more than the graphics, I appreciate getting trailers that don't have very obvious and nauseating frame drops. Some of the performance issues Scarlet and Violet had made the games extremely disappointing to me because I had trouble even playing the games without them turning into slideshows that gave me headaches. The good news is that I've taken so long to write this script that we've actually received confirmation about the frame rate. As of the announcement trailer for the Switch 2, we learned that Z-A, along with Scarlet and Violet, will have Switch 2 versions, and/or potentially paid updates, that will enhance both performance and resolution. Z-A will actually run at a solid 60 frames per second, which hasn't been the case for a main series Pokemon game since Pokemon Emerald in 2004. This is incredibly exciting news, and it has raised my hopes even higher for the game. That said, even though I am very happy to hear that Z-A will be able to run at a full 60 frames per second, I personally feel that this is industry standard. It should also be mentioned before I move on from the Switch 2 version of Z-A that this enhanced version is, at the moment, stated to specifically increase the resolution and performance. There is nothing to suggest that the textures, models, or effects will be improved, so please keep this in mind as we continue discussing the graphics of Z-A. Even though I do consider these graphics to be a significant improvement over Scarlet and Violet, I can't say that I think this is the best Pokemon has ever looked. You may be expecting a Gen 1 or sounding argument about how Gen 3, Gen 4, and Gen 5 were peak visuals for the franchise, and you'd be right, but I'm actually going to argue in favor of Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee being the all-time best visuals out of any main series Pokemon game. Sword and Shield had some very specific places that were gorgeous, but Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee consistently look perfect. The lighting, the character models, the saturation in all of the colors present throughout the game, it's all simply immaculate. I think the trend towards realism that Game Freak has been moving towards since Gen 8 dropped is a misstep. Yes, Game Freak got a lot of criticism because of the Sword and Shield Nintendo 64 tree. However, I think this tree looks extra bad when the visual goal of your game is to look real. The stylized anime-like visuals of Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee not only look good, but they're simple and easy to get right. You don't need to stress over detail as much because you simply don't need it. And because of this easier to handle style, the odds of things that look horrible, like the Nintendo 64 tree appearing in the game, is drastically reduced. Let me give you a few examples from within the first Z-A trailer itself. At first glance, everything looks great, but only if you glance at it. If you actually take the time to appreciate your surroundings as you would in a detailed environment, you'll immediately notice that some things are not right. For example, let's look at the balconies. If you merely glanced at them, you might not notice that they're actually 2D. These balconies are baked into the texture, and that makes these buildings feel flat and box-like. I know this seems like a petty complaint, and admittedly, Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee don't have very detailed architecture either. However, that's my entire point. In a game like Z-A that's trying to be realistic, I'm going to notice how all the buildings are just flat boxes that have 2D balconies, and that defeats the entire purpose of trying to be realistic. Another example is the grass that poorly meets with the terrain terrain. The way the individual blades of grass meet the ground just looks a little weird, especially when games like Sword and Shield handled their grass in a much more palatable way. The more you try to make a game look real, the more out of place and awkward these kinds of issues will feel. The Nintendo 64 tree in Sword and Shield probably wouldn't have looked as out of place on the 3DS, but it does look out of place on the Switch where most other things looked better. And this realistic style is just that. It's a style. The textures in Z-A are not all that impressive. They're really low quality in comparison to other Switch titles. Keep in mind I said Switch titles, and this game will also be releasing on the Switch 2, where the only improvements will be to the performance and game resolution, not the texture resolution. Why try to have a realistic style if that same style is immediately sabotaged by low resolution textures? Some of you may be wondering what the difference between game resolution and texture resolution is. The simplest way I can explain it is by using YouTube videos as an analogy. Let's say that you're watching this video in 1080p. For the sake of the example, we'll call that the game resolution. But I can still show you a really crunchy looking image at 1080p, like this really low resolution texture. So in effect, if the textures are still poor looking, all the increased resolution will do on the Switch 2 version of Z-A is give you a clearer look at something that looks bad. I know there are concerns about optimization, especially when it comes to Game Freak titles, but that's the cost of realism. You can't, or at least shouldn't, try developing a title with a realistic style if you don't know how to keep your game as optimized as possible. There are far more detailed games on the Switch that are far better optimized. Pokémon games struggling with performance as much as they have lately is entirely a Game Freak issue. One thing that I noticed in the trailer is that Game Freak actually did move away from realism in one area, and that would be the Pokémon textures. It might have been hard to tell, but the detailed textures from Scarlet and Violet are not present on Chikorita, Tepig, and Totodile. The colors of these Pokémon have been saturated again, which I am very pleased with. However, this feels odd when you take simple anime-styled Pokémon designs alongside similarly styled characters and throw them into a realistic environment. There's a clashing of style that doesn't look particularly appealing to me, at least. Another thing that caught my attention in the trailers were the animations. For the most part, everything looks okay, though there were two animations in particular that I wanted to discuss. The first is that there is a complete lack of an animation for ascending to the rooftops. At first, I thought this was maybe unavoidable to some degree. Maybe the roofs and the streets are different loading zones, and there must be some sort of a break in gameplay to hide the two areas as they load and unload. However, it doesn't seem like transitioning from the ground level to the rooftops is loading in a new area. This isn't necessarily a problem because technology-based teleportation in Pokémon has existed since the start of the series with Generation 1. However, I can't shake the feeling that the lack of animation wasn't intended to show off the advanced state of technology in the Pokémon world. I think it's far more likely that the lack of animation was instead the result of Game Freak once again cutting corners and finding a creative yet awkward-looking solution. The idea of rooftop battles brings up a whole other series of points that I'm not sure how to feel about. At first, I didn't like this idea because while the idea of trainers running around up on the rooftops having Pokémon battles seems very cool, the Pokémon Game Freak chose to represent this idea was Hippowdon. I don't like the idea of a Hippowdon of all things running around up on the rooftops from a world-building perspective. Hippowdon is a very heavy Pokémon, which means that it's probably very loud. Hippowdon also enjoy using the move Earthquake, which could cause a lot of different problems. Outside of the unbelievable world-building aspects of rooftop battles, examining how the player moves between roofs reveals another interesting detail. It appears as though the player has a phone that can carry them from building to building. At first, I thought this maybe wasn't actually the phone, and maybe Game Freak edited the animation to hide a spoiler. Say, for example, that the phone is somehow tied to Zygarde, and when the phone is used, Zygarde is summoned like a ride Pokémon. I thought that perhaps a new flying form of Zygarde was carrying the player, but we get a good look at the animation in the Switch 2 trailer, and it seems like this is not an edited animation and that the phone itself is indeed carrying the player. While I think the idea of traversing between the rooftops is good, I don't quite like the idea of the phone itself moving the player. Game Freak has put a lot of attention on how transportation works in recent generations, which is great, but most of their solutions are not as fun as prior solutions. This problem really started in Gen 7 when Game Freak introduced the concept of ride Pokémon. Ride Pokémon are Pokémon that you don't own, can't battle with, and can't do anything else with other than use for transportation. Ride Pokémon were intended to replace HMs. However, in practice, this raises a lot of world-building questions and, potentially more importantly, means your choices regarding the Pokémon on your team don't matter when it comes to interacting with the world. Some would call this streamlining the exploration process. There's nothing more frustrating than exploring a considerable distance away from a Pokémon Center only to find out that you're missing an HM on your team, so you have to walk all the way back to the Pokémon Center and then walk all the way back to where you just were. I understand exactly how frustrating this is, but Game Freak's solution to fixing HMs is to give you a bunch of Pokémon that aren't yours, Pokémon you have no bond or story with, and reduce the impact of your own choices in how you build your team. The HM system was so antiquated that most fans loved this idea, and I mean, come on. Most people simply used a Pokemon like Bibarel to handle all of the HMs they could, but there were several other ways the HM problem could have been handled that I'll address in a later video. I brought all of this up because the obvious next step in streamlining traversal is removing the Pokemon aspect altogether. Legends Arceus gave us the Celestica Flute to summon ride Pokemon, the Gen 7 games gave us the Poké-Ride, and Scarlet and Violet condensed the multiple ride Pokemon into one Pokemon. Sword and Shield was the first time we saw traversal completely replaced by an item though, with that being the Rotom Bike. Now, in Z-A, we're back to an item serving as our method of transportation instead of forming bonds with Pokemon that we actually caught. I'm incredibly disheartened to see Game Freak give us a game all about living together with Pokemon in one city while simultaneously removing ways in which we can use our own Pokemon to interact with the world outside of battling. This has been an entire tangent relating more to gameplay and world building, so let's refocus on graphics. The last point I want to discuss related to graphics is in relation to Mega Evolution. It seems like every Mega Evolution now has this strange whitish rainbow sheen to it, something that was previously missing from Mega Evolutions. I can't say that I appreciate how this looks, but I do appreciate what I think Game Freak was trying to do. I think Game Freak is trying to show that Mega Evolution makes the Pokemon overflow with life energy, but I think they went about this in the wrong way. The sheen on the Pokemon makes them look very strange, especially in semi-realistic environments. Instead, I think that an aura effect would have been a much better choice. That way, the overflowing life energy aspect could be represented with motion and transparency instead of making the Pokemon look super glossy. Game Freak for some reason refuses to use effects where they should. In Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, Pokemon like Charizard, Rapidash, and Infernape all have suitable looking fire effects on their body. Game Freak has decided to not use this approach in Z-A, instead opting to use blobs that give the appearance of fire instead. This wouldn't be a bad choice in a vacuum, but I don't like how this looks in Z-A for a few reasons. The first is that I think this approach to fire once again clashes with the detailed environments, but more importantly, this way of handling fire clashes with how the sheen looks on Mega Pokemon. Before I show you an example, let me show you some Mega Evolutions where I think the sheen works. Mega Ampharos looks great with the sheen, as does Mega Absol. The sheen works on these Pokemon because they're already quite brightly colored, but when you place the sheen on a Pokemon that is darker colored and a Pokemon that has darker colored blobby fire, you end up with what I consider to be the most visually unappealing thing shown in any of the Z-A trailers. Mega Charizard X looks atrocious here. The rainbow colors in the sheen are overpowering the other colors of Mega Charizard X to the point where I can barely tell what the color of the fire from the mouth is supposed to be. In addition to not being able to tell what color the fire is, it's difficult to tell that this is intended to be fire. If I didn't know that Mega Charizard X had fire coming from its mouth and that it was a fire dragon type, I may have been confused into believing that this is a dragon fairy type Pokemon that was inspired by balloons or something. The reason I believe Mega Charizard X looks atrocious isn't because I think it's actually bad to look at. This is far prettier than the Nintendo 64 tree in Sword and Shield. No, the reason I think this is atrocious is because it represents all of the problems I detailed earlier in regards to style clashing. This is Mega Charizard X, one of, if not the Mega Evolution that was overrepresented the most during the introduction of Mega Pokemon. Why does it look the worst out of all of the revealed Mega Pokemon? That isn't to say that it's the only Mega Evolution to have problems, by the way. Mega Sableye is missing the gem refraction that it had 10 years ago on the 3DS. Mega Sableye losing its gem refraction and Mega Charizard X's flames looking horrible have one commonality. They are the result of Game Freak still not deciding on a concrete art style. And because of Game Freak refusing to settle on a style, the personality and unique individual qualities of these two Pokemon have been lost. My fearsome, fiery dragon now looks like a balloon animal. My nefarious gem Goblin looks far less intimidating without the refraction from the gem, making it look twice the size that it actually is. Graphics don't always matter. This is true, but sometimes it absolutely does. A company like Game Freak that puts as much time and thought into its designs as it does should understand how important even the smallest details like these are. I can forgive the style of the Pokémon not matching the style of the environment because the environment is merely set dressing. You're actually meant to be looking at the Pokémon anyway, so the environment is less important to the average player. But when important details on Pokémon like the gem refraction and the flames are significantly damaged or outright missing, I think that that's inexcusable. You may think that I'm taking the loss of the gem refraction too hard, but seriously, what's the difference between Mega Sableye and Sableye? Mega Sableye's eyes change color, the teeth turn yellow, and it gets a big gem. The big gem is the larger of the three differences, so the gem should look better to make up for the lack of other changes. Game Freak understood this in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, so I view the loss of this attribute as an inexcusable and inarguable regression in how Mega Pokémon are being represented by Game Freak. This is also incredibly frustrating because Game Freak is making Mega Evolution returning one of the most important draws to Z-A. Game Freak knows just how excited most people are for Mega Evolution to return, so it is outright baffling to see Mega Pokémon look like they have less care and thought put into them now than they did when they were first released 10 years ago. Alright, that's enough ranting about graphics. We can finally move on to a more fun topic like the starters. Chikorita, Totodile, and Tepig are very surprising to me, but probably not for the reason that you're thinking. I've always expected these three to show up at some point, but only because of the starters we received in Legends Arceus. What I mean by this is that I found it highly unlikely that Typhlosion would get a regional form, but not Meganium or Feraligatr. Considering that Legends Arceus had starters from Gen 2, Gen 5, and Gen 7, I expected the other starters to show up in future titles just to make sure nobody was being left behind. However, I did not expect both Chikorita and Totodile to appear as starters in the same game. Chikorita, Tepig, and Popplio would have been what I expected, but Game Freak does like to keep things fresh. Now that we've gotten Chikorita, Totodile, and Tepig though, it's almost guaranteed that the next Legends title will use Snivy, Litten, and Popplio as the starters. As far as Chikorita, Totodile, and Tepig themselves go, we don't know much, but with Chikorita there seems to be an interesting hint in the trailers. It's only visible for a moment, but we see Chikorita has access to Disarming Voice in Z-A, which is not something Chikorita has ever had access to before. While we don't know for certain, it definitely seems likely that Chikorita will evolve into a regional variant of Meganium and will gain the Fairy type. I say likely because it is entirely possible that Game Freak opts for split evolutions instead of regional forms this time around. It's also very likely that each of these starters will get a Mega Evolution, but then again, Game Freak never gave the original Kalos starters Mega Evolutions either. Game Freak at this time has revealed no new Mega Evolutions, but I hope that all of these Pokémon get the Mega Evolutions that they deserve. If you're still watching at this point in the video, I hope that means that you're enjoying what I have to say. If you're enjoying the video, please consider subscribing. I love discussing these sorts of things with my viewers, and I'm always looking to hear what other people think. I make all sorts of content, but if this video does well, then I'd love to make more in the future. Ultimately, I'd just like to talk with more people about Pokémon, even people that disagree with my opinions. There can never be too many different points of view, after all. I'm finished with shamelessly begging for subs, so now I'd like to get into the topic that I have the most to say about, the new battle system. There's a lot to talk about despite how little we've seen. The first point I'd like to address is the UI. The UI bloat is the worst it has ever been in my opinion. I'm reminded of that Elden Ring if it was made by Ubisoft meme. Why is there a sight indicator if I'm already in a battle? Why can I still see the minimap? Do I really need to see Flame Wheel in 2 different locations on my screen? There's so much unnecessary information being given that it gets in the way of appreciating the surroundings, which is a whole other problem. Battles are now carried out in real time. This means that you can walk around in battles like you could in Legends Arceus, but moving around has meaning because your Pokémon will follow you if they aren't attacking. When your Pokémon follow you in these real-time battles, moves can miss, which means that you can make your Pokémon dodge moves on command. This also means that now more than ever before, you need to be able to see where you're moving. It's unlikely that the minimap or the move selection elements will block your vision in any way that matters. However, I can't say the same for the move history history element above the move selection. If I'm already being told that Talonflame is using Flame Wheel just by looking at Talonflame, which in itself is a decision I don't quite like because it makes battles less cinematic, why do I need to sacrifice more of my screen for redundant information? I could see one or the other being present in the UI because the player needs to know what move is being used, but both of these methods at the same time feels like too much. And if Game Freak really did feel required to have both of these methods in use at the same time, I feel that the move history size could have been significantly reduced. I've completely ignored the UI elements for move selection and party selection because I think these design elements are perfect. Real-time battles seem to imply that you won't get a chance to stop and think about what Pokémon you want to use if you need to switch out, so you need to be able to see your entire party at a glance so that you can make faster decisions. The second point I'd like to address about real-time battles is one that I've already sort of hinted towards, and that is the new dodge mechanic. This has several implications that I do not appreciate at all. The first implication is that you could, in theory, run around in a circle forever and make every move miss your Pokémon. This is not very engaging gameplay in my opinion, and more than that, it seems inaccessible to a certain degree. In the past, Pokémon games were heralded as some of the best and most accessible games to play because of the sheer amount of content that you were able to enjoy all at your own pace. Even if all you had was one finger, you could play a Pokémon game to completion. Real-time battles seem very cool in concept and very fun for those that are able to enjoy them, but this decision will exclude some players from being able to enjoy these games. Not that Game Freak seems to care about accessibility these days anyway, considering the inclusion of some literal anti-homeless benches in Lumio City. Earlier, when I was talking about AZ using a cane, I said it was good representation. How could Game Freak simultaneously show care for people with disabilities and then include something like anti-homeless benches in their game? Maybe Game Freak wants to use Z-A to talk about homelessness, and as such has decided to include anti-homeless benches as part of their game to show the impact it has on the homeless? That's the most favorable thing I could think of, and to be honest, I'm not certain that's what Game Freak is planning. We'll have to see. Game Freak has probably already thought of this dodging forever in a battle idea, and I believe that they have one solution. Game Freak will need to introduce a wider variety of moves that cannot be evaded under any circumstances, such as Feint Attack, and they will need to introduce a wider variety of AoE moves that cannot be evaded if you are in close vicinity to the attacking Pokémon, such as Earthquake. If you didn't notice, the solution to the problem of infinite dodging completely invalidates the entire concept of dodging on command. I could be wrong about all of this though. Maybe there's a timer on how often you can dodge that hasn't been revealed yet. We simply don't know. The second implication of real-time battles is that certain Pokémon will be easier to hit than others. After all, according to Game Freak, size matters. If you have a larger Pokémon, it will take longer for them to dodge an attack. This means that smaller Pokémon will have a significant advantage in this new system simply because they are small. This might sound great to some of you since this adds another level of strategy to how you build your team. Even I can appreciate this change to some degree, though I think dodging on command is a bit too much. Instead, the real problem this introduces is one that you wouldn't expect. Pokémon scale doesn't exist anymore. If you compare the smallest sized Onix in Legends Arceus to the Onix we see in the Z-A trailers, you'll notice one is significantly smaller than the other. Game Freak introduced a battle system that rewards small Pokémon for being small and punishes large Pokémon for being large, but then reduces the size of your large Pokémon so that they aren't punished too much. Game Freak has once again created a problem where there wasn't one, only to introduce a solution that once again makes actually interacting with your Pokémon less fun and interesting. And making all Pokémon more uniform in size for the sake of the dodge mechanic is such a poor decision. I understand that the dodge mechanic sounds appealing to a lot of fans that have wanted to have a Pokémon battle in the same way that the anime does. I do too. But is it worth it at the cost of removing unique characteristics and immersion when it comes to interacting with Pokémon? I don't think so. I know a lot of people dislike dealing with smaller Pokémon in Scarlet and Violet, and I agree that aspect could be polished. But the struggle of dealing with these smaller Pokémon gives them more character. If you've ever gone out in the woods or a field or played with bugs of any kind, you may understand the kind of character I'm trying to describe. Hunting down this minuscule creature that you want to catch or be friends with adds an incredible amount of immersion to your experience, and it makes the world feel significantly more real. In addition to all of these changes to the battle system, how battles start is also being changed. After years of trainers being able to force us into battles, we can finally get the jump on unsuspecting trainers ourselves. I do like this change from a world-building perspective, but I'm not sure about the implementation. For example, starting a battle by sneaking up on another trainer seems to give you the first move of the battle. This seems to sort of trivialize the importance of the speed stat, and it also seems dishonorable. I think this type of gameplay will quickly reduce even trainer battles into blitz encounters similar to how wild battles worked in Legends Arceus. Everything was a one-shot encounter, and everything was determined by which Pokémon went first. This approach is fine when it comes to wild Pokémon battles because, let's be honest, these types of battles are different in nature from actual trainer battles. But this new method of starting battles removes the equal playing field component, or in other words, honor, in how you engage with other trainers. It's true that not every trainer has honor, and that maybe this approach makes the world feel a bit more real since you as a player get to decide how you want to battle. But I also worry that this would reduce the gameplay to the Skyrim Stealth Archer experience, if you know what I mean. I'm excited to engage with this kind of gameplay, although I can't say whether or not I think it's a good idea yet. It depends entirely on how Game Freak has implemented the mechanic. There is another interesting addition with the new battle system, that being moves now seem to have a cooldown after each use. It is highly likely that moves will have varying cooldown durations, which honestly I'm interested in. As funny as it is to spam Earthquake, I think battles would feel a lot less boring if move spamming were less frequent. This spam-reducing tactic would be far more devastating if the new dodge mechanic wasn't so seemingly easy to exploit, but these two ideas together make something that I think is worth exploring at least. Speaking of cooldowns though, there is another cooldown that I haven't seen brought up that much since these trailers were released. Mega Evolutions now have a timer for how long they are active, in addition to having a charge meter for when you can trigger Mega Evolution. I think these are interesting ideas, and it seems like a good way of keeping the strength of Mega Evolutions in check. Or at least that's what I would say if this wasn't a Legends title. While this isn't confirmed, the fact that this game is a Legends title means that Pokémon abilities may not be present in the game. That may not sound like a bad idea because, after all, abilities weren't present in Legends Arceus. However, this becomes a bigger issue when you consider that most Mega Evolutions are defined by their Mega Evolution abilities. Mega Kangaskhan, for example, is one of the strongest Mega Pokémon specifically because of the Parental Bond ability. So if Legends Z-A follows in Legends Arceus' footsteps and excludes abilities, then what is the purpose of Mega Evolution in the game? A simple stat boost on a timer? That idea isn't awful, but it isn't as exciting as what Mega Evolutions meant prior to Z-A. The last opinion I have regarding the new real-time battle system is simultaneously the most important and the least important. Real-time battles in the context of the Pokémon games are a significant departure from the classic Pokémon battle formula. Yes, that formula is old and boring, but it's also tried and true. The simplicity and accessibility of what previous Pokémon games did with their battle system is one of the reasons Pokémon became so popular. There have been many attempts to shake up the battle system since it was introduced, with the only meaningful long-term change coming from Gen 3 with double battles. These prior attempts to shake up Pokémon battling have never brought up concerns about a loss of identity, but that isn't true with this latest innovation from Game Freak. In fact, most people seem to refer to this new battle system as the Xenoblade Chronicles 3 battle system, which in my opinion means Pokémon is losing its identity with this change. Obviously, turn-based combat is not unique to Pokémon, but turn-based combat has been a part of Pokémon since the beginning. Turn-based combat having been part of Pokémon from the beginning does not mean that it is all Pokémon can or should do. However, it has become integral to its identity, especially where accessibility is concerned. Being able to set your game down in the middle of a battle to do whatever you need to do, or taking some time to consider what move you'd like to use, or simply taking a little longer to do something because that's how long it takes you, is of immeasurable value. I concede that turn-based battles aren't inherently as exciting as real-time battles, but real-time battles are factually more challenging physically. And if challenging battles were vital to the success of the brand, I doubt the brand would have lasted this long because Pokémon has only rarely been difficult. And there are plenty of ways to make turn-based combat exciting. For example, here are 3 things that I think Game Freak could do to make turn-based combat more interesting. Introduce more moves with lingering effects. Gen 5 introduced the Pledge moves, which interacted with each other in unique ways, and those interactions led to unique effects. Rain Dance and Thunder, Sunny Day and Solar Beam, these are all examples of the concept of moves that interact with each other and make specific strategies possible. I think that what Game Freak has offered thus far in terms of complex moves with lingering effects is incredibly shallow, and I think there was incredible potential in what moves could be if the Pledge moves from Gen 5 are anything to go by. Another way that Game Freak could keep battles from being boring is to do what they said they were going to do when they did Dexit: comprehensively improve the animations and effects of all Pokémon and their moves. Yes, Game Freak did a great job with specific moves, and yes, doing this would take a lot of time considering how many Pokémon and moves there are. But just look at Legends Arceus if you want to see how important animations are. The animations in Legends Arceus, along with the behaviors of the Pokémon found there, give the game a feeling of soul unlike any other Pokémon game to date. Z-A will likely follow in Legends Arceus' footsteps in this regard, but the important part is that this same feeling of soul must extend to battles as well. Legends Arceus did a fairly decent job with animations and battles, but let's be honest, combat in Legends Arceus is not very good. Battles end far too quickly because Pokémon usually faint after a single attack, or they're too slow and never get in an attack in the first place. Maybe this is why Game Freak wanted to add the dodge mechanic, but that introduces the other problems that we've already discussed. A third way that I think Game Freak could make battles less boring is to reduce the amount of time you spend hearing information that you already know. Remove the not very effective messages after each attack. Remove the fainted messages. Remove as much text as you possibly can, and instead utilize a small action log or action visual that explains everything you need to know simply by glancing at it after the animation has finished. Turn-based combat doesn't have to be, and in my opinion, shouldn't be slow after a player has already made their decision. After the player decides what they want to do, it should be a smooth, cinematic experience until the time where the player can make another decision. Maybe I'm being too pessimistic about the real-time battle system, but it seems to introduce a fair amount of problems for the sake of simply shaking things up. I would much rather Game Freak spend more time thinking about how to make turn-based combat more fun. Before you say it, I know that's what Game Freak has been trying to do with Mega Evolutions, Z-Moves, Dynamax, and all of the other regional gimmicks. The problem is that most of these gimmicks are designed from the ground up to be temporary. Prior to Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, Mega Evolution was stated to be Kalos exclusive, which means Game Freak probably never intended on Mega Evolution appearing after Gen 6 to begin with. Game Freak hasn't seriously tried to experiment with the turn-based combat system since Gen 6, and I think that's very sad. Inverse battles, triple battles, rotation battles, and sky battles all have so much potential, but all they have resulted in long-term is overused and very boring-looking animations for Pokémon like Skarmory, Trampius, and Solomons. Entire new competitive scenes could have formed based on these types of ways to battle, but for some unknown reason, Game Freak refuses to let anything last long enough to grow. And that's the final reason for why I'm not all that excited about real-time battles. Real-time battles are likely doomed to disappear, just like most other innovations Game Freak has tried. And even if the real-time battles stick around despite all odds, the cost wouldn't be worth the benefits in my eyes. Game Freak should be experimenting with what works instead of creating an entire new battle system that functionally excludes players for the sake of excitement and challenge. These same feelings of excitement and challenge could be addressed in other ways, like better animations and more focus on strategy instead of forcing the player to have two fully functioning hands. Turn-based combat has incredible potential in terms of growth, and if anybody could find a way to redefine turn-based combat, I'm sure Game Freak could do it if they really wanted to. There is one more interesting change Game Freak has made to the usual Pokémon formula, and that is how catching Pokémon works. In Z-A, if you knock out a Pokémon, you get a chance to catch it. Personally, I've always wondered why this wasn't already in Pokémon games. If you knock out a Pokémon, it can't resist capture. But after thinking about it for far longer than I should have over multiple years, that's precisely why you shouldn't be able to capture a Pokémon once it faints. To begin with, the whole message about comply or I beat you into submission until you can't resist isn't a good look. But let's be honest here, a lot of people already view Pokémon battles that way. So let's view this from a different angle. The Pokémon anime tackled this unfavorable interpretation of battles by insisting that Pokémon who are captured are choosing to come with you. Or at least, that's how most Pokémon and Pokémon trainers interact. For some reason, Pokémon can still be stolen by other trainers or organizations like Team Rocket. This idea is of course immediately called into question though, because Pokémon in both the games and anime can exit their Pokéballs at any time, which really makes you consider whether or not Pokémon can be stolen without the use of some sort of technology that overwrites how Pokéballs work. Anyway, back to the original point. Pokémon value a good battle and will give a trainer a chance to train them if they display enough courage or determination or even simple relentlessness. Ash and his shiny Noctowl are a great example of this type of bond. There's value in making a Pokémon difficult to catch if it results in players feeling a stronger bond with their Pokémon. Considering most people probably don't think of their Pokémon encounters like this, let's look at this problem from a gameplay perspective. If there's a Pokémon that's really rare and you really want it, you'll likely experience a rush of excitement when you find it. You may even be so worried about messing up your rare opportunity that you specifically train a different Pokémon to help you capture your target before you start hunting for this rare creature. Not only are you experiencing genuine accomplishment when you finally capture your target, but you are also rewarded for your planning, or you end up feeling lucky, or even if you fail, you have a memory that you'll never forget. This is known all too well by shiny hunters who all have stories of shiny Pokémon they've planned extensively for, spent a lot of time on, and either succeeded or failed in acquiring their target, both outcomes resulting in memories that will never be forgotten. Now take everything I've said and consider that most players will now simply knock out every Pokémon they come across and then decide whether or not they want to catch it. Not only does this increase the length of time each wild Pokémon battle takes because you'll have to either wait for the Pokémon to faint or outright decline to catch the Pokémon, but it also reduces the significance of encounters in general by making failure to capture less punishing. Now, to be fair, we don't know what the catch rates will be. Maybe it'll be higher or lower, who knows. But I worry that the ability to catch a Pokémon after it faints may result in otherwise memorable encounters becoming trivialized and thus less significant, which in turn lessens the connection a player will have with their own Pokémon and as such lessens the experience of playing the game. Speaking of catching Pokémon, I think it's important to mention that we've seen Patrat and Pansear in the trailers. This is significant because these two Pokémon haven't been available in the wild for almost a decade due to Game Freak's horrible Dexit decision. I want to be specific here because I do not like the Dexit decision. It took Game Freak 8 years to bring every Pokémon to the Switch. I'm going to talk a lot more about this in the future, but for now let's focus on Z-A. Z-A seems to imply that we'll be getting all of the Pokémon that have been missing since Sword and Shield introduced Dexit, and I'm moderately excited for this. I'd be a lot more excited if Game Freak simply let people use the Pokémon they want to use, but at least they finally made good on their promise to make sure no Pokémon will be left behind. Unfortunately, this goal was reached exactly at the most opportune time for Game Freak, given that it took the entire lifetime of the Switch and the goal was only met as soon as the Switch 2 was announced. But I'm sure that's just a coincidence. And the existence of Pokémon Champions seems like it will finally let everyone use all of their Pokémon in one game, just not in a story-driven main series title where connection with your Pokémon is the most important. Where you catch Pokémon is also important, and I'm very interested in seeing how the Wild Zones in Lumio City work. At first, we were led to believe that the Wild Zones would be the only place players could catch Pokémon, and that these Wild Zones were created so that humans and Pokémon could coexist better. Certain kinds of Pokémon already exist in cities naturally, but these Wild Zones would be a great place for other kinds of Pokémon to make their home. We now know that Pokémon can be captured outside of the Wild Zones, and I've seen some question the purpose of the Wild Zones as a result. While I understand the confusion, I think the point I made a moment ago should clear up the purpose of the Wild Zones from a gameplay perspective. Binnacle, for example, would have no habitat in Lumio City if it weren't for these Wild Zones, and thus wouldn't be obtainable. Because of cases like this, I think Wild Zones are a great idea, though it brings up questions about other cities that I'll save for another time. And that about covers my thoughts so far regarding Z-A. There are a lot of topics in this video that I touched on that I'd like to explore further in the future, so maybe I'll do that sometime if this video does well. As far as Z-A itself goes, I'll say that I'm very, very cautiously optimistic. Game Freak is doing a lot of experimentation, which I think is unusual enough to give it a chance, but I'm also reserved regarding whether or not this much experimentation can work. Or even if these experiments do work, if they are truly to the benefit of the franchise. At the very least, I'm excited to try the game out on the Switch 2, since it has been far too long since I've been able to enjoy a Pokémon game without severe frame rate drops. This issue being fixed by itself is enough to excite me, such has been the unfortunate state of the games for far too long. And to give Game Freak some credit, I wouldn't have thought that Legends Arceus would have been as fun as it was, yet it was one of my all-time favorite Pokémon games. Sometimes, Game Freak's innovations can lead to a lot of fun, and that's why I think Z-A and its questionable decisions deserve a fair chance. Once again, I'd like to ask you to subscribe and leave a like if you've made it this far into the video. I'd also ask that you leave your thoughts in the comments, even if you disagree with the points that I've raised in this video. I love hearing what my audience thinks, and finding new perspectives that maybe I haven't considered before is always fun. Anyway, that's all for now. Thanks for watching, and I hope to catch you in the next video.